I know they're bringing.
I haven't seen nobody else wear it like that.
I'm a trendsetter.
Oh, okay.
My friend gave them to me last year. She ordered them and they were too long for her. I said, well, you're 5'2", I'm 6 foot. If they're going to be too long for you.
All right, sharing the screen so that everybody at home can see it as well.
Oh, why not? I will.
All right, so this morning, what we're going to do is we're going to pick up where we left off last Sunday. So I do have handouts over there. And what we're going to do is still continue to talk about how the flood changed God's creation. So if you remember where we left off, we were talking about how when God created everything, he said it was perfect. He said, and it was very good. So that means he put everything together the way that he wanted it. Everything was working together, and anything that Adam and Eve needed, he provided. So when he put them in the garden, everything was just there. They could pick any fruit off of the tree, of course, except for the tree of knowledge of good and evil, which inevitably is what they got in trouble for. And then also any vegetables, any berries, everything just grew without any help from them. Well, when they sinned, part of the curse was that anything that they were going to have to eat, they were going to have to provide for themselves. So that's when they started to have to till the ground. They had to plant. They had to wait for it to grow. And that is more difficult than we probably imagine. Because right now, I mean, we've got farmers that are farming right now. And what's the biggest thing that they rely on? Rain. It didn't rain on the earth until the flood. So think about that, how hard it would have been for Adam to till the ground, plant, wait for it to grow, because the only watering that it got, based on what I showed you last week, was from what? Dew that fell, and then underground springs. And we do know that there were rivers, because it says when God put him in the garden, where the garden was located was at the intersection of 4 rivers. And only 2 of those rivers are known today, the Euphrates River and the Tigris River. The other 2 rivers, no one knows where they are. Well, that means that the geography must have changed a lot from the time of Adam and Eve being kicked out of the Garden of Eden and today. So what's the big event that changed the earth so drastically? That's Noah's flood. So that's what we were talking about last week. So the part that I was really looking forward to talking about last week, and I didn't quite get there, was the really cool stuff, the dinosaurs. Got to talk about the dinosaurs, right? So as those of y'all that have been in my class before have heard, Christians over the years have really had a hard time with dinosaurs. Some Christians even go so far as to say that the dinosaur bones, the fossil evidence, was actually placed here by Satan in order to confuse Christians.
Who says that?
But that's not the case at all. Well, remember that couple that we were...
Yeah, but they were nutty.
They were nutty. Yeah.
They had some other ideas.
Yeah. So the other thing is that Christians have a hard time trying to rationalize what they learned in school with what the Bible teaches us. So a lot of times it just gets ignored. Well, we're just not going to talk about that because we don't know the answer. But remember, we're told in the book of James that we need to always be ready to defend the truth.
Right.
That's one of the commands that's given to us by God, is that we can't ignore the hard questions. We have to be ready to address the hard questions. And that's why we're here this morning, so that we can learn the biblical answers to address those questions. So remember that when the flood came, it caused worldwide geologic changes. There were things that only a catastrophe could cause. And if we look at the science that's placed before us, only two ways to look at it. Science looks at it with this big word that I used last week, uniformitarianism. And uniformitarianism is this idea that the things that we observe today must have happened that way all along. If that's the case, the only way that it can happen is if there's millions and billions of years. But the big thing that they are excluding is a all-powerful creator that judged the earth and caused something so catastrophic that it changed the way everything worked in an instant. If you look at scripture, that's what scripture tells us. And scripture spells out all of the changes that we see today. But science tends to ignore all of those explanations. Why? Well, it's not what they want. There's a bigger reason why, though. If people admit that there is a God, then they admit that there is someone that has authority over them and someone that they are accountable to. They lose control. Exactly right. So science always wants to provide the answer. And if it's something that they can't answer through experimentation, then they discard it. And so that's where we find ourselves today. So Psalm 104, verses 5 through 9, it says, "He established the earth upon its foundations so that it will not totter forever. You did cover it with the deep as a garment. The waters were standing above the mountains. At your rebuke they fled. At the sound of your thunder, they hurried away." It goes on in verse 7 and verse 8. "The mountains rose, the valleys sank down to the place which you did establish for them. You did set a boundary that they may not pass over, that they may not return to cover the earth." This explains everything that I laid out for you last week. Remember, one of the biggest things that the naysayers pose for the reason that the Great Flood didn't happen is because there's no way the water that's all on the earth could ever be collected to cover up the highest of the mountains. Mount Everest being like 27,000 feet. So this scripture is more proof that the mountains as they are today are not as they were before the flood. So before the flood, the mountains were maybe 6,000 to 8,000 feet tall. And doing all the math with all of the water that's on the surface of the earth today, with all the water that's in the oceans, the lakes, the rivers, all of the water that's frozen in the polar ice caps right now, if that was all melted and the earth was completely level, then all of that water would cover the earth to a depth of 8,000 feet, which is more than enough to cover up the highest of the mountains as they were prior to the flood. Now, based what I said last week, when all of the fountains of the deep, all the water that was underneath the earth started geysering up, there was nothing to support the surface of the earth at that time. So what did the crust of the earth start to do? It started sinking down. And if you have a sphere that's this big and it's got a hard crust, and all of a sudden it's being pushed down to something this big, what does all that crust have to do? It's going to start crinkling up. And that's going to push mountains higher, and that's going to push valleys deeper. And so that's the explanation that the Bible is telling us here in Psalms for why the mountains then grew as high as they did, and why the valleys then went as deep as they did. And then we also see the promise in here that the earth's not going to be covered up completely by flood again. And that's that promise that Noah saw when God put the rainbow in the sky to promise that the earth would not be destroyed by flood ever again. So when the fountains of the deep burst forth, there was a rift that developed in the ocean basins. And so you can see on this picture the dark areas that are in the water. Right now, what scientists call those are the continental plates. So you've got the plates of the land masses that are still in motion today. And now there's no buffer between the surface of the earth and the core of the earth. And so when these plates crash against each other in one side and separate from each other on the other side, you're going to end up with earthquakes and volcanoes. So because of God removing all of the water that was underneath the crust of the earth, pushing it all up to the surface and in the atmosphere, it's caused the geologic changes that we see today. Something else that's been measured by taking drilling core samples in the bottom of the ocean, they can actually see the layers of the earth, and they are showing that the magnetic poles in the earth shifted dramatically at one time. And science has no explanation for what caused this. But if you look at the creator, the destruction of the earth with the flood, and the upheaval of the land masses, that makes a great explanation. So the fountains of the great deep are jetted high into the atmosphere. And because of all of that dust and ash that then gets thrown up into the atmosphere, you've got particulates that the water vapor can then collect on. And it's just like when you seed a cloud to make it rain, all of that dust and the ash then seeded all of that vapor. The water condensed on those dust particles, getting heavy enough that the atmosphere can't support them, and they all crash down. And so we've got floods from below, we've got floods from above, and it all collapses. Now, because of this upheaval, we also have the continents rearranged. And we end up with the landmass that science today calls Pangea, all of the landmass all together, separating now out along these continental rifts, along these lines that we see in the oceans, and everything rearranges to the point that we see the continental shapes that we recognize on our maps today. Okay, so any questions over any of that? We good? Could you explain that to someone else?
They're just gonna call you.
Okay, yeah, you got my number. So science today talks about that this change happened over millions of years, right? According to this cataclysm, this would all happen very quickly, violently.
From the geologists that I saw, they said it all happened in a year.
So if something that drastic happened while there was life on the earth, then all of the life on the earth would be destroyed, according to science. But Noah, Mrs. Noah, Ham, Shem, Japheth, their wives, they were protected from the violence of the continents breaking apart because they were on top of the
So
water.
it all happened during the flood.
It all happened during the flood.
flood.
Yeah. During the 40 days of the flood, or the year that it took for the waters to recede.
When the poles changed, like you have a bulge of water in the equator.
Yep.
When they changed it, it all dispersed.
Yeah, so right now there is a bulge of the waters at the equator. Spin of the earth, centrifugal force, everything. But when the poles switch so violently, the shape of the water would be more like an hourglass, pinched at the waist of the equator. So there's all kinds of physics that goes along with this too. There are a lot of scientists in the world that do believe in creation, and they do believe in the cataclysmic destruction and rearrangement of the earth. And these are good scientists who do the science, who do the math, but they do it in the frame of God causing it all. And so the math is sound. The science is sound. Remember what I said last week, God invented science. So they don't have to be at odds with each other. You can show that whenever the Bible speaks about science, it is 100% right 100% of the time. But at the same time, the Bible's not a science book. And so you're not going to be able to find all of the scientific answers just laid out. Okay. All right, great. So sediments. Now that we've got all of this water that's covered the earth, raining for 40 days, 40 nights, after that, the rain stopped, but the water remained. And Noah and his family and the animals that were saved were on that ark for a year before the waters receded. Well, now we're going to have to think about, where did the waters go and how did they get there? Okay. Well, where are the places that we find waters today? Okay, in the low spots. So the low spots today are what we call the oceans. And then the rest of the water, up to 60% of the water that's on the earth, is trapped in the polar ice caps.
Really?
Yeah.
That barrier was no longer keeping it 70 degrees.
You were listening. That's awesome. That's awesome.
One person.
All right. So now the Earth's temperatures are going to be dramatically changed. Where before it was temperate, it was moderate, it was a good average temperature over the entire Earth. Now we have water covering everything. Water is a great heat sink. Okay. It will absorb the temperature or any heat that's put on it. And when that water starts to recede, the land, which is a good reflector of heat, is going to now start weather patterns. And we're going to see places where air wants to rush to, and we're going to see places where air wants to rush from. We're going to have winds. We're now going to have the jet stream get put in place. All of the weather patterns that you see now when you watch the news, which is all just a guess, that people that watch things have a little better handle on than people who don't. But all of those things get set into place because the waters are receding and exposing land that no longer is in one place. It's spread out around the entire globe. When the water starts rushing away from the high spots, as the mountains rise up, as the land rises up, as the valleys of the ocean go deeper, that runoff happens at a huge rate. So I don't remember if I mentioned it last week or not, but when we were talking about the island of Surtsey, I know I mentioned Surtsey, and then I talked about Mount St. Helens, the volcano. So when Mount St. Helens erupted, the rushing water from the lake that was burst dug a trench in the ground that was 100 feet deep. And it dug that trench in less than a day. Now imagine if we've got a year's worth of water that has to run off the land. How deep of a trench did it dig?
Probably Grand Canyon.
Probably the Grand Canyon. Okay.
Something present day that helps identify what you're saying is, like, in current day, we're talking about El Nino,
Right.
how the water affects the weather, everything's affected by what goes on in the water. Now, I always bring, that always sticks in my mind.
Yeah, so all of those kinds of weather patterns didn't exist before the flood, and everything was put in place after the flood. Last night, we went to a party and I was talking to an engineer, and he mentioned something else that now I've got to research, and it's the duodecadenal Pacific, and I can't remember the last word, but every 20 years, the water that's in the South Pacific and the water that's in the North Pacific swap.
What?
And when it does, it changes the weather patterns and causes the southwestern United States to have severe droughts. Think about it. There was a huge drought in the 1950s that everybody knows about, the Dust Bowl. If you look back in records, there was a drought in 1930. There was a drought in 1970. We had a drought in 1990. There was a drought in 2010. And it's like, now I've got to do some research because that would be pretty interesting.
Saving
Yeah.
some water for 2030.
Right, and that's why we were talking about it, because I'm working for water companies now. He does engineering for water companies, and the water companies actually are looking up to 2030. Where are they going to get the water? Especially think about us. We've got all of this growth that's happening around us on the I-35 corridor, also on I-10 coming out of San Antonio, I-10 coming out of Houston. Everything is just pushing along the interstates. All of this growth that's happening here, what's going to happen when we don't have the water to provide for all that growth? So I've got to do some research now to find out more about that, because that's more of the climate change meant in the right way because of the flood, a great catastrophic event. All right. So the sediments that cover the face of the earth now, because of the runoff of all of this water, 70% of the Earth's surface geology is sedimentary, which means the layers of rock that were laid down by water depositing all of that soil of different type, layer on layer on layer. And it happened very, very quickly, so that the first layers are squished down with pressure because of all of the other layers that are getting laid down on top of it. Now, that's important to talk about, not only because of geology, but also because of paleontology. Starting to talk about dinosaurs. So structures that, like the Grand Canyon, were formed by the flood sediments. And if you look at a cross section of the different layers in the Grand Canyon, you can see that the canyon was laid down by sediments when the flood happened. And then erosion of the waters as they receded through those layers. And so it makes perfect biblical sense. So the layers of the Grand Canyon were laid down by the flood, and these layers extend 100 miles north and 100 miles south from the Grand Canyon. So this map here, you can see the 4 states, and you can see these dark areas. If we dammed up the Colorado River, where it exits these geologic formations, where the land starts to get flatter, then the water that fills the Grand Canyon would make a lake that goes all the way from central eastern Arizona all the way up to the north part of Utah. That'd be some lake. But that's how deep the Grand Canyon is and how far stretching all of that erosion is as those waters ran off. Okay, so when we talk about the sediments as they were laid down, were the floodwaters just slowly rising, or did they really come in a hurry? There's a baleem whale that has been excavated from the diatomaceous earth beds near Lompoc, California. And the whale was trapped in sediments in a vertical position. So the waters came so quickly, it pushed that whale up and then buried it on all of the sediment. So that the whale buried in the sediment was standing up. That's how quickly that all of this sediment was laid down. Okay, pretty cool. So, need to talk about fossil graveyards. This is something that I just found out 2 weeks ago, and I was so excited to share it with y'all last week, and we didn't get that far. So the flood happened so quickly that the animals almost immediately drowned. Now, notice I said almost, so we're gonna have to talk about that too. But as the waters were running to go to the low places on the earth, all of the dead animal carcasses were pushed along with that current. And all of those dead animal dinosaur carcasses then were collecting in the low spots and then were covered up with all the sediment. When they find dinosaur fossils today, it's not like one fossil that's found in a field. They find one, they're immediately going to start roping things off and searching for more, because when the fossils are found, they are found in huge collections.
It's like on the seashore when a bunch of fish dies,
Right.
just covered, because that whole
Right.
shore is just
Right.
covered.
It's not just one dead fish laying there. You see all of them pushed by the current. The dead dinosaurs got pushed the same way. And so we have huge fossil graveyards that show millions of fossils that are all pushed together in one place
Yeah, they're
and
different.
covered up.
They're not all the same.
And they're not all the same.
They drown.
Different kinds of animals pushed to one location. And that's where their fossils are found. I thought that was really cool. So we can now explain, because of the runoff, why our ocean floor geography and the mountain buildup happens the way that it did. It also explains the abundance of the water on the earth. All of the astronauts, when they talk about what the earth looks like from space, they say it's a giant blue marble. Before the flood, it was a giant green marble because of all of the growth of the plant life that was there before the flood. So after the flood, now we've got a blue planet. This also will explain the presence of marine fossils that are found on the mountaintops. You can find shells on mountaintops. How can that happen?
To not be a mountain.
It used to not be a mountaintop. It got pushed up after the flood. So the rapid burial of plants and animals. So explains why the fossil beds are so extensive. Imagine how many animals and how much plant life existed before the flood. That's why there are so many fossils that can be excavated today. So here's a coelacanth. So science today tries to explain it as a transitional form somewhere between a fish and a lizard that had legs. So they try to make that be the missing link. Well, they found out after they discovered a living coelacanth that actually these fossil remains was a squished coelacanth. So because of all the sediment crushing down on that fish, it smushed it out and made it look like it had legs. So there's a lot of science that they've had to adjust when they make other kinds of discoveries. So yeah, this is a living fish today. So
Ew.
if it's a living fish, how could it be a transitional life form between
And it's still the
fish
same, looks the same.
and lizards? And it still looks the same today. So 95% of all fossils found are small marine animals.
Mhm.
Plants are hugely abundant in the fossil record. Most people, if they find a fossil, it's usually going to be a fern or a leaf of some sort. And, you know, pretty much everybody can go into their backyard and find some sort of fossil. Petrified wood. We have a lot of petrified wood around here.
So that just shows that it was a rainforest all over the earth.
Exactly right.
So,
Okay. And that is why there is so much fossil fuel today all around the world. The whole earth was so covered by plant life that was immediately pushed over and buried with all of the pressures of all of the sediments on top of it. It formed these layer of rich beds of fossil fuel, coal, lignite, and oil, natural gas. And all of that was laid down because of how rich in life the planet was before the flood.
And when it got cut off, there was no oxygen to get to it.
And that's actually part of the decomposition process that formed the fossil fuels today. That's why your fossil fuels are made of complex chains of carbon and hydrogen with no oxygen. It's all buried.
So it also makes diamonds.
It also makes diamonds, more pressure.
What brings into question age?
How long, you mean like how long it took to do it?
Well, I'm thinking about this, it's just one example, but when they split open a large chunk of coal somewhere, I see this number. It brings more questions than it does answers. It was like, kind of like a hammer, with an old boy. With a wooden handle,
Okay,
partially covered with a coal that was forming on it.
oh, cool, I would like to see that.
How could that have happened, as they say, anywhere I've heard, recent numbers like 250 million years and other numbers like 450 million years.
Yeah,
Well, how would that wooden handle have survived 450 million years? Plus, who in the world ever bored a hole in a piece of iron?
Right.
right. And that's stuff that science just kind of ignores. And they try to blame it on pranks and try to blame it on people confusing the science. Yeah. So it explains this flood and everything explains the rapid extinction of the dinosaurs. We don't need a giant asteroid crashing into the Gulf of Mexico to cause what we see. Okay. And science argues with itself here. Astronomy will tell you that the Earth is protected from the large meteors and meteorites by Jupiter. Jupiter is a giant vacuum cleaner in our solar system. Jupiter has almost as much gravity as the sun does. So anything coming from outside of our solar system, Jupiter's gravitational pull is going to grab it and crash it into Jupiter, which is why Jupiter is so scarred with all of the different colors on its gas because of all of the asteroids and meteors that crash into it. Well, if astronomers are saying that Jupiter is sucking up all of the asteroids, then how can the paleontologists say that the Earth, all the dinosaurs and everything were crushed by impact of a giant meteor? You can't have both. You can't.
Oh, that's cool.
So the dinosaurs died violently. And you can see by the shape of the fossils, the way that they were preserved, that they weren't just taking a leisurely stroll across the meadow when it happened.
They're running.
They were running and they got smushed very quickly. Recent anomalies from the fossil record. So they found some interesting things. There's actually in amber, we talked about amber before. So it's petrified sap of a pine tree, and there's insects and things that have been found in it. That's why we got Jurassic Park, the movie, right? They got the DNA of the mosquito out of the blood of an animal that the mosquito sucked on, you know, right? So they've actually found some dinosaur remnants trapped in amber as well. And so dinosaur blood, y'all, if this dinosaur blood was 450 million years old, just to pick a number, y'all, DNA does not last that long. It decomposes too quickly. There's no way that it's going to last 450 million years. And yet they were able to extract the DNA out of the blood that was trapped in this amber.
They're not gonna make one, are they?
They can,
Don't want them to.
but haven't you seen the
Haven't you
movie?
seen the movie?
You know? And then a dinosaur heart, they think that that's actually a dinosaur heart here. There's really no way to prove it the way that it was petrified,
Yeah.
but it's kind of cool.
Mhm.
So I talked about this meteor theory already. It fails, can't use it. But there is something dramatic that did happen. And something changed not only on the Earth during the flood, but in the solar system as well. There's this thing called the KT boundary. And it's this thin layer of radioactive material that's found all around the Earth between two layers of sedimentary rock.
What?
And the best explanation is that there was some sort of stuff that hit the Earth at the same time all around the Earth. Could it be a meteor impact? That's what science is trying to say. They're saying that this meteor impact, when the meteor hit the ground, the meteor vaporized and all of its dust and everything then covered the earth like a cloud and then settled and covered the entire earth with this radioactive material. But that's not necessarily the only explanation. So there could be other things that was in the vapor canopy that was protecting the earth from the other radiation. And instead of the radiation bouncing off, going back out into space, it could have been some sort of sponge that God put there to absorb the cosmic radiation. And then when the vapor canopy burst, all of that radioactive material came down and got deposited at the same time. Okay. And this is a thin layer. It's less than 2 inches. And it covers the whole earth. It's just this weird thing that's found between 2 layers of rock. So we talked about weather patterns. Meteorology has been changed. All of the seasons started after the flood. And we've got these new earth temperature conditions, and they're trying to reach a new kind of equilibrium. And while it was doing this, there were parts of the earth that became desert and parts of the earth that became frozen tundra because of the shifting weather patterns. And because now of nothing to absorb the temperature of the sun, there's parts of the earth that now get completely covered in sheets of ice. Most likely when Ham, Shem, and Japheth started migrating away from where the boat landed, that many of them, probably 2 of the 3, came across icy conditions because the new ice age had formed. Now we know Ham went south into the area that we now call Africa, but Shem went east into what's now Tibet. That was icy, it's still icy today. And Japheth went north up into Europe. And so at that time also, the small alterations, the small adaptations of the human race began. And because of being exposed to more snow, higher altitudes, our eyes had to protect themselves from snow blindness. So all of the descendants of Shem actually grew a little bit more eyelid that actually covers the eye and makes it have a more slanted shape. That's where the Asian eye comes from. If you lift up that skin, it's a regular eye. It's just extra skin, which is why some Asians who want to look more European will have that eye surgery to have that extra skin removed in order to open the eye shape. At the same time, Ham going south into Africa, we've got the situation being exposed to more solar radiation, which of course produces more melanin, which then produces darker skin, which protects them from the solar radiation. Okay, so, and this happens as small adaptation. Okay, that's how the races come about. So here we've got a picture of the Berescova mammoth. It was completely frozen in hours. It still had daffodils in its stomach. Daffodils are a summer plant. And the woolly mammoth was frozen with the daffodils still in its stomach, showing that the ice hit it immediately. What was that movie? The day after?
Day after tomorrow.
Day After Tomorrow. They actually talk about the weather patterns. It's a relatively recent movie, and it's like Save the Planet, but it's a movie that talked about how these giant hurricanes formed and brought super cool temperatures down in a matter of minutes, freezing everybody in just a few seconds. It's kind of cool.
Wait, go back to the fed their dogs, the meat.
The mammoth meat was so well preserved that the discoverers fed it to their dogs.
That's crazy.
Yeah, that's neat. All right, so I want to get to some other stuff here.
Okay.
You know, the only thing that Darwin got right, he said that you can have an evolution within the species itself, within the species,
It's called an
You know, like the cats.
adaptation.
Yeah,
like with the dogs. But
Yeah.
they're the same. You can't turn from one to another. And, you know, they, each within their own specific species, they can adapt to different areas.
yeah, very true. So one of the cool things about the fossil record, as the fossils are found, they show that the fossils that are deeper in the earth are all very small marine animals. And as you get further up in those layers, the life forms become more complex, what science says more evolved.
Yeah.
And they use this idea to argue that these layers were laid down over millions of years. And so few million years earlier, the animals were not as evolved, right? And then now we got another couple of million layers of sediment. And now those animals were more evolved because they had more millions of years to evolve. We got all kinds of problems with this. If that land was there for millions of years, why isn't there any erosion? There's no erosion shown in these layers. If they were exposed to the same kind of weather that we have today for millions of years, wouldn't those layers show that same kind of erosion that we see today? It doesn't exist. All of these layers are flat. And they're all laying on top of each other, flat. No erosion. They ignore that part. Can't explain it, so let's not talk about it. So if we talk about the geologic column, which is the study of these layers, evolutionists use that to prove evolution over these millions of years. A better explanation, the animals that couldn't walk couldn't get away from the water as it was rising.
Died first. Duh.
Doesn't that make so much sense?
Yeah.
So the simpler life forms are the ones that had to slither and crawl or swim, right?
Well, and the bigger
They're
ones-
getting buried.
Yeah.
The bigger ones are stepping on top as the flood waters are coming up. They're swimming and getting on the sediment as it's starting to be built up. And then they eventually drown or they get buried by the sediment as well. Okay, Suzanne, what were you saying? Right, and then we talked about that last week when all of the salinity of the water changed so quickly. Killed them off too.
That place on the left, that goes through around Waco or something, there's a place like that.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know where that
They
picture.
built the wall, I mean, the building around that, so that's kind of cool.
Yeah.
Let's find out where that is.
Yeah, that would be a good, cool place to see.
Yeah.
There's a walkway over it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's cool. I would like to see that. So a catastrophic explanation for the uniform geologic column, uniform meaning it's found all over the world, is that the less able animals got buried sooner than the more able animals. And this lays out the reptile, the fossils as we see them
Did
today.
they find all of the fossils from the people too?
No, they find some, right? But most of them, people being the smartest, survived the longest.
Right,
They didn't get buried, they got decomposed.
that's what I thought.
The only thing that they've ever been able to find is footprints.
Yeah, I'm gonna talk about that too. So, were there dinosaurs on the ark? Yes, absolutely. Herodatus reported a flying reptile in Egypt in the 5th century BC. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle reported a flying reptile near Mount Palatus in the 13th century. So the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle is a book consisting of the history of the Anglo-Saxon people. It's compiled into book form in around 890 AD. One entry from year 793, I'm going to read it. It was in Middle English, which doesn't even read like King James. So this is translated. Here were dreadful forewarnings come over the land of Northumbria and woefully terrified the people. These were amazing sheets of lightning and whirlwinds, and fiery dragons were seen flying in the sky. A great famine soon followed these signs, and shortly after, in the same year, on the 6th day before the Ides of January, the woeful inroads of the heathen men destroyed God's church in Lindisfarne Island by fierce robbery and slaughter. And Sitka died on the 8th day before the calends of March. So this is actually talking about several things, including the Viking raids that came into Northumbria. If you ever watched the show Vikings, that's where they got their information. They pull it from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle.
It's really gross.
It's gross, but yeah, it's accurate. But did you catch that?
Yeah.
Dragons
Yeah.
flying in the sky. I need to ask you why every culture in the world has dragons in their history. Because they're dinosaurs. Okay? Every culture has a dragon story. And it's because somebody in their past saw the dragons. A well-known science book, the Historia Animalium in Europe, lists dragons as real creatures in the 16th century. And it says they are extremely rare because they were hunted into extinction. And they're relatively small as compared to those of old. The conditions don't exist post-flood that existed pre-flood.
They can't get that big.
And so they can't get as big as they were prior to the flood, but they were still large animals.
Well, you've seen the lizard now, right?
Yeah,
It's pretty small.
small dinosaur. In America, the Sioux Indians have the legend of the Thunderbird, which is based on eyewitness accounts, plural. I counted at least 13 tribes that have Thunderbird stories. An enormous bird whose wings flapping sounded like thunder. Okay. Other dinosaur sightings in recent and not so recent history. In Zaire, Africa, many eyewitness accounts from the 50s, 60s, and 80s. The witnesses described animals that were 15 to 30 feet long, mostly head, neck, and tail. The head was distinctly snake-like, a long, thin tail, and body approximating the size of an elephant, or at least that of a hippopotamus. The legs are short, with hind legs possessing 3 claws. The animals are reddish brown in color. They have a rooster-like frill running from the top of the head down the back of the neck. Sounds like a brachiosaur to me. The city of Nerluc, France, was renamed in honor of the killing of a dragon there. This animal was bigger than an ox, had a long, sharp, pointed horns on its head, and the descriptions of the armor plating of its crown were just like a triceratops. They did also talk about its tail being spiked, and that would be like the stegosaur. And they have stories of stegosaur around 900 AD in Ireland. All of these would be descendants of the dinosaurs, small dinosaurs, that got on the ark with Noah, his family, and the rest of the animals. Okay? It is cool. So the dinosaur footprints tell the tale. It's not just 1 or 2 footprints when they're found. Usually it's a whole flock of footprints. And there would be why would there be so many dinosaurs moving in one direction at one time? They're running away. They're running away. Okay. So why do dinosaur and human footprints appear together? Because the humans are running away too. Now, in order for the footprints to be preserved in rock, it first needs to be made in semi-soft material like mud, and then quickly covered up before the rain or the runoff could wash it away. So I'll ask the question again. Why would so many of these footprints be found together and all moving in the same direction? Everybody is running away.
There you go.
Here's a cool footprint. This is actually from Glen Rose, which is just south of Fort Worth, I think.
Southwest.
Southwest. So many things can be deduced from this fossil. You can see the dinosaur footprint here. You can see a human footprint here.
Right there.
Scientists have authenticated the dinosaur track. Scientists say, yes, that dinosaur footprint is real, but they claim that an artist later carved the human footprint in the rock. Now, it's interesting that there are no tool marks. Hammer and chisel always leaves tool marks. If you watch any forensic shows, they always look at tool marks of any kind of weapon that was used to stab. It's something that can be found. Interesting that the weight distribution from heel to arch to toe is proper. And it's interesting that the ratio of the weight from the impression of the dinosaur to the impression of the human is proper. And it's interesting that the weight distribution across each shows that there's more weight on the toe than there is on the heel, which is indicative of running.
Steve, that's cool. We're today. Maybe not as long, but it was Triceratops.
Yeah,
For instance, one of them is just reported in one of the documents with a child, a 6-year-old child was picked up. What a woman described the mother, described as what would look like the Triceratops. Dropped the child because examining it, the clothes were torn off. He didn't have really grasp of the child, had grasp of
clothes.
Yeah.
The child fell on his clothes.
Yeah, yeah,
But in other situations where the child would pick up and disappear. Some while later, they found the remains of the child in something that looked like something larger than a beagle. And the child they picked up was with, and they found.
yeah. So the Native Americans also have several accounts of small Indian children, Native American children, that were picked up by the Thunderbirds and taken to their nests. And so they had to rescue them from the Thunderbirds. So yeah, there's a lot of tales around the world in more recent history of dinosaurs.
Let's go
So-
next year there.
Loch Ness. Everybody knows Nessie, right? The Loch Ness monster. So the first recording sighting was in 565 AD by an Irish missionary.
Is there a picture?
Yeah, about 6 years.
Several hundred sightings over the years, 20 alone in 2018.
Really?
Exponentially more sightings as cell phones
Oh.
became available. Based on the description, it appears to be a plesiosaur, and there appear to be some adult size and some of juvenile size that are in Loch Ness. So the Loch Ness monster type sightings also occur in Ireland, Sweden, Russia, Australia, and the United States. The photo on the right was taken when it was caught by the Japanese fishing trawler in 1977. This was caught up in its fishing nets. Later, DNA analysis confirmed that it was not avian, so no bird. Kind of looks like wings, right? It was no bird. It was not mammalian, which means it wouldn't be a whale,
Right.
right? And it suggests that it was reptilian, but they still tried to call it a type of shark called a basking shark.
That is not a shark.
Okay, and the reason why they said is because basking sharks, when they decompose, that they decompose from the bottom up to their jaw. And so this is the remnants of a basking shark. Doesn't make sense.
The squishy.
I don't know, but it would be in the Great Lakes, but I'm not sure which Great Lake it was. So if I remember from what Steve said, it was the Upper Peninsula of Michigan that they saw it up there. So there is ample evidence to indicate that some dinosaurs lived after the flood, okay, which means they had to be on the ark. Over 400 species of animals have become extinct in the last 350 years.
Right.
So it's not a stretch of the imagination to say that these large dragons were hunted to extinction. Think about what you know about English knights of honor. What did they have to do?
Kill a dragon.
They had to slay the dragon and rescue the princess. I mean, that's the whole story. And so all of the dragons of Europe were all hunted to extinction. So man may be the ultimate cause of the demise of the dinosaurs. So how do you date a fossil or a rock? The cartoon here says, this fossil trilobite tells us that this rock is 400 million years old. And then the kid says, well, how do you know the trilobite's that old? And the professor says, because it's found in such an ancient rock. That's pretty much how they're dated. Rocks are dated as old as they think the fossils are in them should be. And the fossils are aged to be that old because they're found in the rock that they say is that old. It's a catch-22. It's kind of like you can't use a word to define itself.
Yes.
You can't use a fossil to determine the age of the rock that it's been fossilized in. Okay? All right, that's all I've got for you this week, and I almost made it on time, right?
Yep, you're like 4 minutes over.
All right, that's not too bad.
Yeah.
So glad y'all came. I hope you have a great rest of the day.
So if there, when heaven is back on earth.
Yeah.
There'll be no ocean.
No, there will be.
Oh, there will be.
Yeah. Yeah.
There will be no ocean.
So the old Earth, our current Earth, when it gets destroyed, it says that the ocean is the mountains will sweep away.
Yeah.
That's going to be part of the destruction. But then God created a new heaven and a new earth. And that new earth, the Greek word that's used for new means of the same kind.
So you think the water barriers will be restored?
But it could be of the same kinds that he created originally.
Yeah, that's what he's kind of saying. So yeah. it could be.
So rather than, oh, that's cute.
Yeah.
I would
Not
assume that
tainted
because
by
that
sin.
was.
That's a good guess. Be kind of humid though. Hair would be all.
I don't think we'd care so much.
Glad you came.
Thanks for having me.
Let it go to sleep.